Certainly one of the great treasures of the Roman Catholic tradition is the collected pastoral learning and lived experience of the saints in helping the people of God navigate their spiritual journey. We rightly celebrate the great minds and the respectful thoughts of those who have gone before us and who have left us such a strong legacy of helpful and useful tools for living the Christian life. These men and women whom we celebrate share with us the experience of created humanity. They were and are men and women of a particular time and place. Historical giants who lived their lives with faithfulness and who we remember to this day. As a Redemptorist, I celebrate the life and outstanding contributions to the development of moral theology that were made by St. Alphonsus Liguori. For me and countless others, he is remembered not only as the founder of a religious congregation, the Redemptorist, but also as a doctor of the Church, the patron saints of moral theologians and confessors. For well over a century, if not more, it was his pastoral applications of the principles of moral theology that were considered to be the gold standard. Pope Gregory XVI in 1831 taught that the opinions on faith and morals of St. Alphonsus Liguori were reliable and in accord with church teaching. Therefore, the Pope stated, his conclusions are trustworthy. Certainly a rare but welcomed compliment, one that would probably have both pleased and embarrassed the saint. In addition to St. Alphonsus, I could most certainly add to the list, if I were in fact intent on constructing a list of notable teachers of the faith, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, St. Therese of the Child Jesus, St. Bonaventure, and many others. All men and women of faith, each of whom would most certainly be considered reliable and trustworthy teachers of the faith and faithful representatives of the Catholic tradition. That is, until what they taught was not as reliable and trustworthy as it might have been. Sounds scandalous, but it's also true. Each of these great saints are historical people. Each of us who remember and honor them are also men and women of history. That is how God has created the great saints and each one of us to live our humanity in a particular time and place. In addition to living in history, any person is also at least partially defined by the history that they experience. Some were able to stretch their imagination and the constraints of the historical moment. Others were able to offer an insight into the future that proved to be useful. Most were content to be faithful interpreters of the lived experience of faith in their time and place. They faithfully consulted the men and women who preceded them and studied their works. However, they never, even for a moment, were so presumptuous as to believe or insist that they were representative of any other perception or judgment than their own authentic experience of time and place. Simply put, St. Thomas Aquinas needs to be understood and appreciated as an intellectual theologian and philosopher that lived in the 13th century. You cannot demand that the teachings of this great saint reflect the knowledge and application of the principles of science and mathematics that had not yet been discovered. You cannot demand that St. Alphonsus taught moral principles about sexual morality, for example, that accurately represent the medical understanding of human reproduction. Human reproduction was not properly understood until the 20th century. And the operating principles that were used previous to the 20th century are inaccurate. St. Alphonsus was a brilliant and compassionate moral theologian and pastor from the 18th century. His teachings on sexual morality lacked the full consideration that's necessary for the 21st century, as would be expected. We cannot demand otherwise, and I do not believe that the saints would disagree. If St. Thomas and St. Alphonsus were alive today, I have to imagine that they would use their brilliant minds, their pastoral sense of the sacred, and their profound respect for the human condition in a manner that reflects our current reality and knowledge. They would not insist on what they had discerned hundreds of years ago, based on what they could research and what they could prove demonstrably. Their teachings would reflect modern science, recent discoveries, and would reflect the human experience and conditions of the centuries that have unfolded. I struggle to believe they would be ardent defenders of what they had once written so long ago. I cannot imagine them ignoring present realities and present human experience. Rather, they would be the champions of the new experience, the new vision of church, and the new understanding of the relationship between God and humankind, particularly without the influence of the dominant hierarchies of both church and state. I believe that to think otherwise is disrespecting of their memories, their teaching, and their love of both the human family and the people of God in relationship with their Creator. We should be respectful of our historical heritage. We should be grateful for the men and women who have gone before us and who have tried to share with us their wisdom, their discernment, and most of all, their love for God and His people. At the same time, we should not force them into a frozen prison of historical perspective and champion, and most of all, teach what can no longer be proven through the process of technology, science, psychology, and the human experience that is reflective of the grace of God. That's not honoring them. That's mocking them. It's a disservice to their memory and their effort on behalf of the people of God. Although this perspective is both true and accurate for all people, it is of particular accuracy and necessity to both understand and to accept for those who struggle with scrupulosity. It's not helpful for the scrupulous person to look into our historical tradition for supposed answers and directives to the challenges and the struggles that might be experienced each day, for no other reason than the distinct possibility that an historical perspective is often lacking the fullness of what needs to be considered when making a decision. The most obvious illustration for this truth is this. Until a few years ago, scrupulosity was misunderstood. It was primarily understood as a spiritual struggle, a catechetical issue. There was no understanding or consideration of pathology and mental illness, not because the great saints chose to ignore these considerations, but rather because they did not know such considerations even existed. You cannot include facts and demonstrable research into your answer if you do not know it exists. It would also be extremely foolish to insist that the proposed remedies of the past be implemented as an answer in our time and place, for the simple reason that if it was good enough for the saints, it's good enough for me. That perception is frankly indefensible and unreasonable. It's like stating, I'll take a horse instead of a car because I want to be like St. Alphonsus or St. Teresa of Avila. Absurdity, not piety, not devotion, not a good spiritual decision. It's absurdity, nothing more, nothing less. It's also fruitless and an essential error in judgment to refuse to accept that all things, including spiritual perceptions and understandings, develop and change over time. If you choose to deny this fact, then you're blissfully unaware, or perhaps deliberately unaware, of the developing concept of theological understanding that can be demonstrated. You need to look no further than the Church's understanding of usury, for example. It could not be any clearer that change is not only possible, but demonstrable and real. I understand that some commentators, especially those who try to dominate social media, often ignore this reality for theological warfare, but it does not make it any less truthful. Here at Managing Scrupulosity, we honor the saints and are thankful for the manifestation of God's grace in their life and in their contributions to the understanding of who we are as the people of God. We also honor the continuing presence of the Spirit of God in our own time and place. We acknowledge that we have much to learn, that there are far more questions than there are answers, that clarity and absolute certitude are wonderful ideas, but that wonder, mystery, awe, and even for that matter, chaos and confusion are far more recognizable. We try to avoid black and white answers to the grace center where most historical reality is experienced and lived. It is uncomfortable. It is a challenge, but it's also a powerful manifestation of the grace of God at work in our lives, in the lives of the Church, and most of all, in and through the people of God. St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, St. Therese of the Child Jesus, St. Bonaventure, and St. Alphonsus Liguori, pray for us.